President Gerald R. Ford. Fascinating two-episode interview on Later with Bob Costas. These aired June 12th and 13th, 1991. And Ford obviously had a lot to talk about. I mean, he, longtime congressman, first came to national prominence via the Warren Commission, studying the assassination of JFK. Some say he was heavily involved in not letting the truth get out. And then 11 years later, he's, becoming president of the United States because he had to replace scandal-plagued Spiro Agnew as Richard Nixon's vice president. And then when Nixon was toppled in the Watergate scandal, Ford had the difficult and unenviable position of becoming president and replacing someone that he had a friendship and a political relationship with for many, many years, and someone who had not been quite straightforward with him about the situation, it sounds like, in this interview. And so Ford had to walk a thin line, and not only between him and Nixon, but between him and America. The perceptions of Gerald Ford, magnified by Chevy Chase and Saturday Night Live, was that he was a bumbling, stumbling fool. He's obviously not, not only the interview, but who he was. But Costas comes right out and maybe asks the most pointed question I've ever heard Bob, and one of the bravest questions I ever heard Bob ask, is, how do you react to people's summation that you're not presidential material, a nice, decent guy, but just not up to the stature of the office? And Gerald answers, you can tell it ticked him off, but what a gentleman, what a statesman, what an American.
Thanks for staying up later. We're back in New York. Our run in Los Angeles is completed, and this, they tell me, is our 500th program. So we went to the A-list for a guest and came up with former President Gerald Ford. We have 2 shows, but obviously 22 shows wouldn't be sufficient to cover everything we're interested in, so we'll just plow straight ahead and hit on as many things as we can in this combined 2.5 hours. Let's start with vice presidents. You were one once. George Bush came this close to being your vice president.
That's true. When I became president almost overnight, I had to make a decision under the 25th Amendment who would be my successor as vice president. And the candidates were George Bush, Nelson Rockefeller, Ronald Reagan, and 1 or 2 others. And we went through a very careful process trying to evaluate who would make the best vice president at that time. It was a close call, and my final decision was Nelson Rockefeller, but I had a wonderful relationship with George Bush, as indicated when I sent him to China as my representative, or our government's representative in China, and then after a year brought him back, put him in charge of the CIA.
You never dreamt of becoming president. The Congress was what mattered to you, right?
Yes, I really enjoyed serving in the House of Representatives. My total political ambition, Bob, was to be Speaker of the House of Representatives. I gradually worked up to the leadership on the Republican side, and after becoming the leader in January of 1965, I became a candidate for Speaker, but my Democratic friends, each 2 years for the next 5 elections, had majorities. So my attempt to be Speaker never made it. I just didn't have enough troops.
You had to know, however, when Spiro Agnew was forced to resign and you were selected by President Nixon as his successor, partly because you were so popular in Congress that he knew he would have no problem getting you through, and you sailed right through. You had to know that there was a strong possibility at that point that you'd become President of the United States because Watergate was fully underway.
Well, when I became Vice President, Watergate was a very important issue. But it didn't really heat up until sometime in 1974. Quite honestly and very frankly, I was hoping that it would not take place, that Mr. Nixon would stay on for the remainder of his term. But I guess in the back of one's mind, if you're vice president, there's always a possibility that you might become president.
How awkward was it for you as Watergate unfolded and it became impossible to rationalize, at least fully rationalize, President Nixon's position? And your reputation has always been, even among those who disagree with you politically, your reputation has been as a straightforward and honest individual. How awkward was it to be his vice president?
It was a very difficult path to follow. I had to be extremely careful not to appear to want to be president, and therefore I had to follow a pretty straight path, sometimes maybe ducking a question from the press just because I didn't want to appear to be overly ambitious to try and become the occupant of the White House. It wasn't, Bob, a very comfortable position.
Did you face him down at any point and say, look, I need to know, within the confines of this room, what's the extent of your involvement? And was he truthful with you?
I asked him not as bluntly, perhaps, as you've just indicated. I wanted assurances that he and others in the Nixon White House group were not involved in the Watergate break-in. I was assured, maybe not as specifically or directly as I would have preferred, but I certainly got the assurance that he, President Nixon, was not involved, had no prior knowledge of the break-in.
You write in your autobiography of August 1st, 1974, when Alexander Haig calls you into his office and he has heard the damning June 23rd tape, and he knows it's all over.
Well, Al Haig came over to my office in the old executive building and told me that the Smoking Gun tape was going to be released the following week. I think Al came into my office on a Friday. He said the damage was severe.
Good evening. President Nixon stunned the country today by admitting that he held back evidence from the House Judiciary Committee, keeping it a secret from his lawyers and not disclosing it in public statements. The news has caused a storm in Washington, and some of Mr. Nixon's most loyal supporters are calling for his resignation.
It was highly likely that either there would be an impeachment on the one hand or President Nixon would resign on the other. He didn't know what would be the answer. In that discussion, he presented 5 or 6 options that might happen. He didn't ask me to comment on any one of them. He was just outlining what the possibilities might be when the tape was actually released to the public.
You wrote of your last meeting with President Nixon where he told you, last meeting while he was president, where he told you of his intentions. What sort of emotional state was he in?
I must say I thought he handled himself very firmly, very straightforwardly. He analyzed for me why he was taking this very, very serious action and expressed to me certain recommendations, one of which he hoped that I would keep Secretary of State Kissinger on, which was very, very easy for me to do because I had such high regard for him. He made some other observations and recommendations about how to handle the Congress. Of course, with my background in the Congress, I thought I could handle that as well, if not better than he. But anyhow, it was a good exchange under very, very difficult circumstances.
Was there gallows humor?
I wouldn't say that, Bob, no. President Nixon was a strong, straightforward person in all his dealings as far as I'm personally concerned.
Was it appropriate or possible for you to express at any time your disappointment? You had been a strong Nixon supporter, supported him as a congressman in '52 when he was vice president and the slush fund bit came up, or I guess he was a candidate for vice president. There was talk of throwing him off the Eisenhower ticket in '56. You strongly supported him. There was talk that he might have selected you as vice president in both '60 and '68. He didn't. All the while you stood by him. You were very different sorts of personalities. I guess people would wonder if there ever came a moment where you fixed him in your gaze and you just said, Dick, why? How?
Well, it was, of course, very, very disappointing when all of the facts came out in the Watergate investigation. It was not only disappointing, but I must say very surprising, because the Nixons and the Fords had had a long, long-standing personal relationship going back to 1949, when I first took the oath of office 2 years after Congressman Nixon had taken his oath of office. We belonged to a social organization called Chowder and Marching. I had campaigned for him while he was in the Senate, and he had come to Grand Rapids to campaign on my behalf. We had a long and I would say very good personal relationship. So that added to my respect for him as a person in foreign policy that was as good, if not the best, certainly in this century, of those occupying the White House. A mistake was made. Instead of being forthright about the mistake, the whole problem got entangled in politics, and the net result was a very disappointing final chapter.
Again, referring to your book, you wrote that at least at times, maybe the night he resigned, the next day when he addressed the staff before heading out to the helicopter, you thought he was out of touch with reality.
By that time, Bob, I think he was. He had been besieged from all sides, the Congress, the press, the public. There's no question that when you're under that kind of pressure, you do sort of retreat into the catacombs of the White House, if that's the way to say it. And I suspect that probably had an impact on some of the decisions.
We think sometimes when things happen that don't go the right way, we think that when you don't pass the bar exam the first time, I happened to, but I was just lucky. I mean, my writing was so poor, the bar examiner said, we just got to let the guy through. We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended.
As he walked out toward the helicopter, everyone who is old enough to remember recalls the scene. You and your wife, Nixon and his family. People wonder what, if anything, he said to you.
At this point, Bob, I can't recall precisely what Betty and I said to Dick and Pat. It was a very, very hard moment because of our long friendship and the sadness of a president resigning and leaving the White House. I don't think there was a more traumatic experience in our lifetimes, because that was a very difficult day in the history of the United States.
You had to feel the elements of Greek tragedy about the whole thing. Everyone there must have. A man of tremendous powers and intellect, formidable man, brought down by seemingly what should have been trivial flaws that kept being magnified and magnified until they overwhelmed all of his strengths.
Well, it was extremely difficult for Betty and me because we had this long-standing personal friendship with both of them, and we had such respect for the presidency. And to see this occur, to develop, just tore our hearts out. And it was a tough way to begin a new career as President and First Lady.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
I don't expect to uncover any new information here, but it's obligatory that I take a swipe at it. When Haig spoke to you on August 1st, 74, he raised the possibility of a pardon, but without any agreement from you. So Nixon left office, according to all accounts from your side, left office uncertain of his fate. True?
That's exactly right. He had no possible way of knowing that some 3 or 4 weeks later, I would make the decision to issue a pardon on his behalf.
Haig raised it. Nixon himself never raised it to you?
Nixon never raised that question with me.
What convinced you to do it? And in retrospect, did you ever regret it?
First, I've never regretted it, and as a matter of fact, today, I feel more certain that it was exactly the right thing to do. But let me outline the situation that precipitated my decision, and it was my decision, not that of my staff. In the first 3 weeks of my presidency, we had a growing economic recession appearing, higher unemployment, more inflation, higher interest rates. At the same time, we had the tragedy of Vietnam getting worse and worse and worse. At the same time, our allies were apprehensive, and we couldn't be oblivious to the possibility that our enemies might take advantage of this situation. Those problems demanded that I spend 100% of my time on the business of our country. The truth was, the first month I spent 25% of my time listening to the lawyers from the Department of Justice and lawyers from the White House staff telling me what I should do about the Nixon tapes, the Nixon papers, etc. Here I was spending 25% of my daily time in the White House on one person's problems, when I should, with all the problems involving our country at home and abroad, I should have been spending 100% of my time on those problems. I finally decided the only way to clear the deck so I could concentrate on what was good for America was to get rid of Mr. Nixon's various problems, and a pardon was the only way to do it. I did it. I feel stronger today that it was the right decision. And to be honest with you, I'm pleased that recent polls indicate that the public is more supportive today, and that gives me reassurance.
But of course, you're not running for president today, and you knew that there was at least a chance that you would run for president, as you did in 1976. And at the time, there were two major misgivings. One, was it possible that Jerry Ford, a symbol of integrity, had worked out a deal, either upon becoming vice president or shortly before Nixon left office? And two, did this deprive the nation of full disclosure?
Number one, there was absolutely, categorically no deal. And as you, I'm sure, know, I volunteered to go up and testify before a House Committee on Judiciary so that there would be no question that there was never a deal. Secondly, I think the country was far better off when they were able to have the matter off the front pages of the newspapers, and the country could concentrate on our various problems at home and abroad. Some people argued, well, why don't you wait till Mr. Nixon is indicted, if he was going to be, if he was convicted, if he ever was, if there was an appeal. But if you had gone through that process, Bob, it would have taken as much as a year or more. And those headlines about a former president and all the things that would be written about it, I think would have continued to tear apart our country when the most important thing we needed was a healing.
Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
President Nixon, who was in very bad health. People recall he had the phlebitis, and he nearly died, according to all accounts. You saw him shortly after the pardon, and it was kind of an emotional exchange.
Well, I went to California on a campaign trip to help some Republican candidates. But while I was there, I had heard that former President Nixon was in very, very bad condition in the hospital. So I felt, on the basis of our long friendship, that I should stop by and see how he was doing. I got to the hospital, and Pat and one or more of his daughters were there because he was a very sick man. The sad thing, in addition to his condition, was when the hospital people were going to let me into his room, the door was locked and nobody had a key. So they finally got a mechanic or somebody to open the door. And when I walked in, President Nixon was, you know, had all kinds of tubes and everything else. He was a very, very sick man. He recognized me. We chatted, or I said a few words, but it was obvious that I shouldn't stay under those conditions. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad I stopped and expressed my personal concern. It would have been unforgivable not to do so based on our long friendship.
Were you disappointed that he wasn't more contrite? After all, technically, accepting a pardon means you've made an admission of guilt. Sometime afterwards, he does the well-known interview with David Frost and conceded some things, evaded others. Certainly wasn't as straightforward about it as you would have hoped.
There is a United States Supreme Court decision involving a presidential pardon. I don't recall the precise sentence or two that indicates it, but the Supreme Court decision says the acceptance of a pardon, in effect, is an admission of the guilt. So regardless of what words or language might have been used or were used, based on that Supreme Court decision, I think the fact is there had to be an admission by former President Nixon.
We'll pick it up right here tomorrow night, part 2 with President Gerald Ford. We hope you'll be with us. Until then, see you later. Thanks for staying up later. This is night 2 with former President Gerald Ford. We covered Watergate and some of the issues pertaining to it last night. Now let's move on to his presidency. You had promised your wife that you would be out of politics by 1976, but obviously extraordinary circumstances arose. You become president, and at least in part, advice from Henry Kissinger was influential in your deciding to run for a full term.
Sometime in early 1975, I don't recall precise date, I had pretty firmly made up my mind that I would not seek election in 1976 because Betty and I had been in Washington. I had been in Congress for over 25, 26 years, and we felt it was time to retire. But in talking with Henry, he was very influential in convincing me that if I were to announce in 1975 that I would not run again, that in effect I'd be a lame duck president, and I would have great difficulty in working with the Congress. I would not have a strong relationship in foreign policy because countries would say, there's a new administration coming along. So based on Henry's very strong and I think persuasive recommendations, I reconsidered. Now, it wasn't easy to convince my wife, Betty, that instead of leaving politics, I was going to seek election, but she was a good sport and went along.
Speaking of foreign policy, it was during your presidency that Saigon fell to the communists. You had been an early critic of our policy in Vietnam, not in the same sense that some Democrats were to get out of there, but in the sense that we weren't fully enough committed to a military victory. In any case, by the time you inherited it, it was almost a fait accompli, and yet it must have torn you up to preside over the conclusion of an obviously failed adventure.
Bob, the saddest day for me and probably for any president in the White House was to sit in the Oval Office and see on television American military and civilian personnel kicked out, literally thrown out of our embassy in Saigon. That was a sad, sad day. And it made me as president feel very badly because, as you have indicated, from the very outset, going back to President John F. Kennedy, when he made the first combat commitment of U.S. military personnel, I supported our country's policy there. I supported President Kennedy, supported President Johnson, I supported President Nixon. I was a critic of the fact that we did not use our military strength to the full capability. I believed then, and I believe now, that if we had used that military strength as we had the potential, there might have been a different result in Vietnam. I have no apologies for that support of the concept of what our country should do in Vietnam. I have no apologies for my criticism of the way the military decisions were made by some in the White House. But I repeat, to sit there in the Oval Office and see the United States whipped, literally kicked out, was not a pleasant experience for a president of the United States.
Are you troubled at all by, and maybe I've got this right and maybe I don't, by the general perception of you and your presidency, which is, here was a man of simple, straightforward decency. He did make every effort to heal the nation. His influence was very much appreciated. Even the fact that he made his own English muffins in the first week after Nixon resigned, and the press came in and saw that, he seemed down to earth and said, play the Michigan fight song instead of hail to the chief. That all those things are appreciated, but they all become part of an image of a guy who was a decent fella, but not of presidential stature like some of his predecessors and successors.
Well, I like half of what you've said, and I disagree very strongly with the other.
By the way, that's a harder question to ask of you than to ask some pitcher why he was knocked out in the fifth inning.
Well, let me put it this way. I've always liked people, and in my whole life experience, whether in athletics, in the Navy, in politics, or otherwise, people, I think, have responded with the same feeling toward me. I like people, and I think people feel that way about me. Now, I think I was a very well-prepared person to be president. I had served in the Congress 25 years. I had been on important committees that handled all of the money for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. All of the money that we were using for our foreign policy, whether in Europe, in the Middle East, or in the Pacific Basin. I had served 9 years as the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, and in that period of time had many, many contacts with President Johnson, with President Nixon. I was included in White House meetings by those two presidents. Even before that time, I had been in a position in the Congress where President Kennedy had asked for my advice and counsel. So I had a good bit of exposure to the White House and all of the problems that a president encounters. In addition, I was very lucky. I was asked by President Johnson to serve on the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. I was one of 7 people chosen for that responsibility, 1 out of the 4 in the Congress. So I had that additional responsibility plus my daily duties in the House of Representatives. So all of that put together gave me a background that I think admirably conditioned me to assume the presidency, even in a very difficult time.
I just want to thank you for having me here, and I'm kind of embarrassed, and I hope you pardon me.
It's obvious you're a down-to-earth fellow with a good sense of humor about yourself, but did it ever grate on you, really get under your skin, when it became part of your image? Chevy Chase, in this very studio, by the way, Studio 8H, right here at NBC on Saturday Night Live, Chevy Chase portraying you.
But I won't have this high office ridicule. I won't be stumbling around and fooling around, making a basic fool of myself for some comedy night, late-night comedy.
Jokes about errant golf shots, beaning spectators, that kind of thing?
I guess subjectively I used to get irritated, but I learned a long time ago, whether competing in athletics or competing in the political arena, that you're very ill-advised to show any irritation. You put on a front, laughing about the criticism and not apparently letting it bother you. But being human, knowing that I was a reasonably good athlete, I played college football, I skied competently, I reasonably played a good game of golf. So I had no lack of assurance about my athletic ability, but if you're going to participate, sometimes you fall down on the ski slopes, sometimes you make a bad shot.
And there was one time, and of course the nature of the media is that if it's a good visual moment that gets replayed and replayed, you're coming down the steps of a plane, you have your right arm, I guess, around Betty, and in your left hand there's an umbrella, and it gets stuck on the step, and there's no free hand to brace yourself, and you go tumbling onto the tarmac, which, if it happened to me, maybe some people would applaud, but certainly it wouldn't be a big deal. It happens to the President of the United States, we're going to see it 100 times.
Well, that was an unfortunate slip, but as you've pointed out, I was trying to be a good husband to keep her from getting wet in the rain, and I just caught a heel on a step. But I must tell you that because of my athletic background, instead of falling on my face and having a bad injury, I landed so that I just rolled over and got up without any help and continued my responsibilities.
You've been tremendously generous with your time, and just a couple more items and we'll let you be on your way. Few first ladies have been held so high in public esteem as your wife. What quality or qualities about Betty Ford do you think make that so?
Number one, she's very upfront. She's always been very forthright and honest in what she says and what she does. She's very dedicated to certain causes. She was very strongly, when I was in the White House, in favor of ERA. After she had her mastectomy, she was very open, which was a lifesaver for countless thousands of women. And of course, as the chairman and chief operating officer of the Betty Ford Center for Alcoholism and Chemical Dependency, she devotes probably 90% of her time for that cause. She's a dedicated person who is very honest and frank in what she believes and what she does, and those are pretty good qualifications.
Women no longer are ashamed of having mastectomies. They talk about it, and I think this has made great progress, and I feel that I've saved many lives.
I had, come to the final end of the road. I didn't really plead. I collapsed.
You wrote in your book that at one time, certainly not intentionally, without realizing it, you had become an enabler for Betty's alcoholism. At what point did you come to that realization and then help her in the direction of confronting it herself?
Well, virtually every alcoholic has an enabler who makes excuses, alibis for various personal activities of the person that's affected by the disease, and I was one. I finally came to the conclusion when our daughter Susan was strongly affected by the problems that her mother had, and Susan convinced me that I was part of the problem. And as a result of Susan's strong feelings, we got the family together, and on a Saturday morning in 1979 had an intervention with Betty that I can tell you was not an easy thing, but an absolutely essential part of the process of getting the situation taken care of.
Without asking you to inappropriately reveal personal details, is that a process where, as you go through it, you say to yourself, I don't know if I can sustain this, I don't know if I can see it through to conclusion, and is there a dramatic breakthrough like in a movie, or is it more tentative than that?
Well, it's not easy, because you have to be very upfront and very strong in illustrating to the person who's having the intervention that he or she must respond. It's what they call tough love. You have to reiterate your love, your affection, but at the same time point out that that person has done things that jeopardize your relationship. It was very tough for our 4 children to tell their mother that things she had done was making it difficult for them, and equally hard for me to say that. But that's the only way you can get through to the person. And those interventions are mainly successful if they're properly held and appropriately conducted. And we were lucky. And the net result is that Betty's now had, I think, 13 or 14 years where she is on a one-day-at-a-time recovery program.
You mentioned the Warren Commission earlier. You were on that commission. I think Allen Dulles, one-time director of the CIA, Senator Russell from Georgia. Only 7 or 8 people on the commission.
I'm the only surviving member.
Oh, is that right? Are you convinced now, as apparently you were then, that the Warren Commission findings were correct?
I'm absolutely convinced today, as I was then, that our basic conclusions were correct, and those were that Lee Harvey Oswald committed the assassination. And secondly, that our commission found no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. Those basic conclusions, I'm absolutely convinced, are sound.
Now, that last phrase is key, because I understand you lobbied for it to be worded that way. Not that there could not have been a conspiracy, but that we honestly found no evidence of a conspiracy. But then that raises the question, was there a so-called rush to judgment? Might there have been evidence of a conspiracy yet to be uncovered that simply didn't come to the attention of the Warren Commission, but the obvious motive to wrap this thing up, heal the national wound, and move on made them less diligent than they should have been?
We did not rush to judgment. We spent 10 full months in page after page after page of testimony. We deliberated and came to what I think were very sound conclusions. I do not think in the intervening years that any new credible evidence has been unearthed. The evidence that we found in our extensive investigation is still the basic information available. Now, some people take our evidence and come to different conclusions, but I still strongly subscribe to the conclusions of the Warren Commission. We had no axe to grind. We made a very diligent search, and I think we came up with good, sound conclusions. We had a superb staff, and today those conclusions are as sound as they were when we made the decisions.
Wasn't there a Senate Select Committee on Assassinations that concluded, they couldn't be 100% sure, but they were 90%, I think they termed it, sure, that there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll and he fired and missed?
I think you're referring to the House Committee.
Okay.
That had an investigation. They came up with some other theories. They didn't have any new evidence. They just took our evidence and came up with a different conclusion.
How affecting was it to go to Dallas and do what you did? Stand in the exact spot in the Texas Book Depository building where Lee Harvey Oswald had stood or knelt as he fired at the president?
Well, it was tough because I knew Jack Kennedy very, very well. When we were in the House of Representatives together, our offices were in the same corridor opposite one another. I knew him very well. I was shocked by the assassination because he was a good friend. To stand there in that window and look down and see a car drive by, or to later interrogate Jack Ruby personally, brought back some great memories, sad memories of my relationship with a good friend.
And lastly, you yourself were the subject or the object of 2 assassination attempts. Right. Squeaky Fromm and then later Sarah Jane Moore, each within the span of several months. What do you remember of that? How frightening was it? Or is it, as you sometimes hear people say, it happened so fast they didn't have time to be frightened?
Well, in the case of both, it happened so quickly. It's over. Nothing you can do about it. Thank goodness you survived. In the case of Squeaky Fromm, it was on the grounds of the state capitol in California. She was following me as I walked from the hotel to meet with then Governor Jerry Brown. She stuck a pistol under several people in front of me, and fortunately one of my agents, Larry Boondorf, grabbed her before she pulled the trigger. The gun was, what, 3 or 4 feet from me at the time. That happened so quickly there was no time to think about it. In 3 weeks or 4 weeks later in San Francisco, I came out of the St. Francis Hotel after giving a speech and walked toward the limousine, and the shot was fired by Sarah Jane Moore, who stood across the street. Fortunately, a Marine or an ex-Marine standing next to her saw her with a pistol in her hand and bumped her hand, and as a consequence, the shot missed me, but there's still a mark on the hotel out there.
Thank you enough for the time you spent with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Bob. It was a real pleasure.
Time for us to say goodnight and see you later.